welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, and today this is going to be the interview I did with Patricia Chadwick on her life growing up in what many would consider a cult at the Center, which was a Catholic-based group. And I hope you guys enjoy it. Once again, I said I'll be going back to SNS archive shows, and I'm working on having a couple. Still got a few couple other guests lined up for later on in this year and early next year. So with Dr. Bruce Grayson on near-death experiences. Dr. Shabir Ali did mention that something came up, so he won't be able to come on, at least for the time being. And also, I do have Dr. Mike Lacona lined up for early next year, early 2021 in January. And of course, I will, once I get the time, I will be working on the cosmological argument. I want to finish up at least part 3 of that by the end of December, if I can manage to finish that. With that said, enjoy the show with Patricia here. Have a great week. And today I'm joined by a special guest, Patricia Chadwick, who's written a book about a memoir of her life and that sort of thing. I'm not going to reveal too much about it, but yeah, welcome to the show, first of all, Patricia.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's basically, you came recommended to me. You've written a book, a memoir about your life, and there's a certain reason that you came recommended. Your life is very interesting in terms of your early childhood and growing up in what many people would call a cult, a Catholic cult. So with that said, I want to turn it straight over to you. Why don't you sort of introduce the audience as to who you are, and mention your faith journey, including your life up throughout your early life there in what many people would call a cult.
Oh, thank you. Yes, my book is called Little Sister, and that is part of an important element of the community in which I grew up. It is the memoir primarily of my time from my earliest memories until I was about 18. And then I kind of summarized life after that. And I grew up from infancy. I was literally into a religious community, Catholic community. And when you think about cults, as has just been, identified as what many people would call my life, you think of these happening in unusual places in the countryside of the United States. This happened right in Harvard Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it was a group of intellectuals who were ardently Catholic. And there were about 60 of them. And they proclaimed a dogma of the Catholic Church, which is a dogma which says no salvation outside the Catholic Church, which means that in order to go to heaven, to be saved when you die, you need to be a Catholic. Now, that's not too outlandish a concept, since we know that lots of other religions also espouse that, which hopefully means that everyone will get to heaven if you belong to a religion that espouses it, and we all accept each other's religions. But within our community, this was something that was frowned on by the Catholic hierarchy in the Archdiocese of Boston. And so when in 1949, when I was 5 months old, this community of about 51 or 2 adults that included a number of married couples, they got together and they formed a religious order that was called the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And in forming that, they promised obedience to the chaplain, to the leader, whose name was Father Leonard Feeney. He was a Jesuit priest. He was renowned. He was brilliantly educated. He had traveled the world. He was a poet. He was a writer. And he had fallen out, in a sense, with the Catholic Church. And so this nucleus of a group of people formed this religious community, and I was an infant. Over the subsequent 4 or 5 years, the 4 or 5 children that were part of the community as infants and little toddlers turned into 39 children. So by about 1955, we were a group of 100 people, 60 odd adults and 39 children. And somewhere around that time as well, we became, or Father Feeney became, excommunicated from the Catholic Church. So we were now outside of the Catholic Church with very few friends, and we became increasingly isolated. And as a child, I grew up in this environment watching the changes, watching how my parents went from wearing worldly clothes, as we refer to them, to taking a religious garb, to watching everyone have their names changed, including my parents. And so I no longer called my parents Mommy and Daddy. I called my mother Sister Elizabeth Ann and my father Brother James Aloysius. And my own name was changed. My name was Mary Patricia at birth. And Father Feeney changed my name to the way we pronounced it, Anastasia, which I detested. And I was 5 years old at that time. When I was 6, I remember there were now 39 children. I was actually the oldest. I have 4 younger siblings. So I was 6 years old, and my baby sister was only about 4 or 5 months old. And the decision was made by Father Feeney and the woman who was his cohort, a married Catholic woman of her own, but who was his age. So they were about a generation older. She was about 50 years old, and he was about, in his 50s. They decided that all of the children who were 3 years or older would be separated from their parents and would be raised communally by one of the women. And when everyone's names were changed, I think this is a detail, and this is why the book is titled what it is. As I mentioned, I'm the oldest in my family, so I don't have any little sisters. But all the little girls in the community were called little sisters, the boys, little brothers, the men, big brothers, and the women, big sisters. So this was the way we were categorized. And that moment, when I was 6 years old, I had a younger sister who was 4, and my brother was 3. And so the 3 of us became separated from our parents, who lived in the community. We all lived in a cluster of 7 or 8 houses behind a red fence in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And yet we no longer had family life. My parents would read us bedtime stories. My father would sing us songs. He would teach us games. All of that was gone. We now led a life of silence. And I'm talking about little children who are 3, 4, 5, and 6 and 7 years old. And that was perhaps the most painful experience of my life. But I was also at the age of 6 suddenly realizing that it fell to me, at least I felt that it fell to me, to become the mother to my little sister Kathy, who suffered terribly on account of the separation and would often go for days without eating, for which she would be punished. And so I found myself in the position of often eating her food for her so that she wouldn't get into trouble. Long story short, as the children got older, now pretty soon, all 39 children were no longer living with their parents. And then Father Feeney also forced the parents into taking a vow of celibacy. And you might ask, what do you mean by forced? Why would anybody be forced to? And my parents absolutely said no when Father Feeney approached them on that matter. And my mother has often told me later on, she was hoping to have 12 children, one for each of the apostles, which I actually found rather hilarious. But being that, she was forced to stop after 5. And I asked my parents why they actually agreed to go along with that. And they said we had taken a vow of obedience to Father Feeney. And all of these changes, which were in some ways monumental, each time my parents would discuss them and say, can we handle this? Should we leave? And they always felt that we would get the most Orthodox, and I'm saying that in a kind of positive way, but Orthodox Catholic upbringing if they stayed. So they made sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice. And when I was 9 years old, Sister Catherine, who by now was really running the place, moved us all from Cambridge to a town about 30 miles west of Boston called Still River. And she had bought about 20 acres of land, and she built a great big house, and there was already one there. And all 100 of us moved out there, at which point we really started living a monastic life. We were no longer, as children, allowed even to talk to our parents. And so we had to wait for her, for Sister Catherine, to announce when we could get together as a family. And while it started off being every week or every 2 weeks, within a few years, it was every 4, 5, or 6 months. And you might argue, how could you survive going that long a period of time without even being allowed to speak to your parents? Now, remember, I would see them every day. They were part of the community. And when we moved to Still River, I mentioned early on that this was an group of people. And my father was one of those intellectuals. He was truly a man, a thinking man. He was getting his master's degree in philosophy at Boston College. He taught philosophy, he taught mathematics. But as you can understand, sometimes in these environments, and I will get to the whole notion of a cult in a moment, the person in control, with the person with the power, wants to make sure they control everyone. And when we moved out to Still River, my father was assigned to fixing the automobiles, something that he actually did very well. The wonderful thing about that, from my standpoint, was that where he fixed the automobiles was right in front of where I had to walk 5, 6, 7 times a day. And so when I would walk past him, and often his head was under the hood of a car, he would look up and he would wink at me or smile at me. And then he would very often just wiggle his little pinky finger to say hello. He did that with all 5 of us. And he was deliberately breaking the rules. And sometimes he would even whisper to me, "How's my little princess?" That communication for me was the glue that held us together until months later we might be able to have a 45-minute meeting with our parents. So this story, as you can see, took place in the 1950s and the 1960s. And I was 55 years old, sitting on my birthday with both of my parents, fortunately, who were still alive at that time. And I said to them, "I'm thinking of writing the stories of my childhood." And I said, when I look back on my childhood, I look back with a lot of pleasure. And they were so supportive about writing my story. I didn't start until 5 years later. And by then I was 60 and my father had just passed away at the age of 90. And I started to write. And I will tell you, my mother read absolutely every word that I wrote. And she only died 2 years ago, also just about 90. And she said, "There are parts of it that make me sad," but she said, "It's all true and you need to publish it." And so I feel very good about having published this book with the blessing of my parents. But if you read the book, you'll see that the word cult does not come up once in the book. I didn't think of my upbringing as being in a cult. And you might say, why at the age of 60, 65, 70, when you're writing this book, did you never think about that? And for me, it was my home. And I loved my home. And I loved the people in my home, my family and the huge extended family that I had, the other big brothers and sisters whom I considered to be uncles and aunts. And if I am very happy I wrote the book that way, because if I had gone in saying this is a cult, I'm afraid I might have been contrasting and comparing to other cults. To me, a cult was Jim Jones or the Branch Davidians. Uh, really out there, bizarre, and often lethal kinds of companies or entities. And I was about 65 or 66 when my 20-year-old daughter came home from college one day and said, Mom, I have two things to tell you. And you can imagine what a mom thinks when your 20-year-old says, I have something to tell you. And I said, okay, what is it? And she said, first, you need to stop everything until you finish this book. And secondly, you need to accept the fact that you grew up in a cult. And that was the first time I really thought about that whole notion. And with the benefit of thinking about it and reading about it and having been interviewed on numerous occasions, I fully accept the fact that it was a cult. It morphed into a cult. Initially, in its early creation, it wasn't. It was a religious community, and I remember laughter. I remember skits. I remember trips to the, banks of the Charles River to pick buttercups, and an environment that seemed so full of family and love and life. But as we became older, we, the 39 children, were told over and over again that we were the luckiest children in the world, because from the day of our birth, we had been dedicated by our parents to God. And I used to think to myself, I don't want this life. I want a life back with my family. And I would have these daydreams, not actual dreams, but daydreams, where I'd be sitting in a beautiful garden with a tall, tall wall around me, and over the wall would come a prince. And we would fly off together and live in a castle and live a fabulous life. And yet, in reality, it was Sister Catherine who was telling me that I was bound to lead the life that my mother was leading as a nun. And I so did not want to be a nun. But never, ever could I frame that notion in words. There was obedience ran through the entire organization. However, when I entered my teenage years, I started to become interested in boys. But none of the boys, none of the little brothers was of any interest to me. So my crush, a few of them, they were, kind of serial set of crushes, fell on to the big brothers, some of the men. It was the most chaste crush you've ever known in your life, because all I could do was look at them and wonder, why I found them so attractive. I understood nothing about procreation, what it meant. Nobody told me what to do about it. I was simply excoriated by Sister Catherine. And finally, by the time I was 17, she took matters into her own hands, and she decided that she was going to kick me out because, as she would describe to people later, I was destroying the vocations of the men. I, a young, completely naive 16, 17-year-old girl. And so we were schooled within our community. And on the day that I graduated from high school, I was driven away. My father, in essence, Sister Catherine said to my parents, I've been unable to do with her what I wanted. Here, take her back. But of course, my parents were still living there. She never reached out to me again. And I was literally, in essence, told, you will never come back onto this property. This is no longer your home. But I knew no one out in the world. I had never been in a restaurant. I'd never watched television. I'd never read a newspaper. I'd never seen a magazine. And there I was, fending for myself. out in the world. And 2 years later, Sister Catherine herself died. And it was then that the place started to crumble. And that is another very good indication that it was a cult. There was a leader that was so powerful, and nobody even probably wanted to fill her shoes. And it was at that time that the children spoke up and told their parents of the enormous physical abuse. There was a piece of garden hose that Sister Catherine introduced as a means of punishment, and it was called the Big Punisher. And it was used daily on different children for any array of issues that you would think might even be cute. But it was horrific, and the parents were shocked. And I can guarantee you, the only people that knew about it were the 8 big sisters who were dubbed to be what was called angels. They were the 8 women, along with Sister Catherine, who raised the 39 children. Only they knew, no one else knew. And when that all came out, the parents really got up in arms. And over the course of the subsequent couple of years, all the parents and literally 90% of the children decided to leave. I wrote this book because I realized, there have been stories written about the center, and certainly stories about Father Feeney, and certainly stories about the doctrinal issues. But there had not been stories written by people who lived the life. Now there have been a few, but I realized when I was about 55 that in 50 years, there would be no more eyewitnesses. And I felt that it was important to share the story as a child who lived it. I was not concerned that my parents would be upset because my mother had read it, but I was concerned about the other 38 children with whom I grew up. Now, my siblings were well aware of the story. But what was fascinating to me was when the book came out, many of those children reached out to me and said, "Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for outing this story." And what I discovered at that point was that so many of them had really suffered from PTSD and had been in therapy for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. I feel very, very fortunate that I don't feel I ever truly suffered from PTSD. And I think that even today, when I think about Sister Catherine and the control that she managed to have over 100 people's lives, I sometimes wish that I could talk to her and say, did something horrific happen to you in your childhood that made you take this approach to raising children? So I hope that's helpful as a little synopsis. I did go on to have a wonderful life, and I did end up with a very successful career, and I am married, and as I mentioned, I have my daughter, but I have twin children who are now 26 years old. And I was asked recently by someone, what would you change in your childhood as you look back? And what would you have done differently? And when that question was asked, I thought to myself, I am in such a wonderful place. I have a happy marriage. I have 2 wonderful children, 3 fabulous stepchildren as well. I have traveled the world. I've had a great career. I'm engaged. And I think if I changed one single part of my early life, maybe this wouldn't have happened to me. Maybe I'd be somewhere else doing something else. So I'm very comfortable saying I would change nothing. I think the important thing is that I always knew that my parents loved me. And despite the fact I was unable to talk to them and unable to engage with them in the way, 99.99999% of families in the world do, knowing that they loved me was what kept me sane. Does that help?
Yeah, wow, wow. That's all I can say to that. So that, yeah, that's quite a journey. I mean, most of my listeners, we've never been through anything like that sort of thing. So, yeah, one thing that I find really interesting about your journey is how many people when they come out of quote unquote cults or environments like that, they're resentful or they suffer from PTSD and these sorts of things, but not with you. You still see that environment. That was home, and there's a part of you that still sees it that way. So maybe I just wanted to throw it open to you in that environment. I won't. I'll refrain from calling it a cult for the moment. But when you look back, what do you think were some of the most defining moments that you'd like, both the good and bad, that you'd like to highlight?
Well, I think it's really important that within my childhood, they were mixed up. The good came with the bad. And the bad is obviously being separated from your parents. The bad is being unable to converse with them. The bad is, me lying in a field and thinking, are we the only 39 children in the whole world who are being raised this way? Uh, but the good is that once the rules have been made and they're immutable and you cannot change them, you have to accept them. If you don't accept them, or frankly, if you don't accept them and just keep wishing for something else, which subliminally, of course, you always do, but you've got to get beyond the subliminal. And in working everyday life, you accept the reality, the silence, the rules, the inability to talk to your parents, and then you create your life around that. And once we left Cambridge and moved to Still River, we ended up having an amazing, admittedly, very religious and very monastic life, but it was full of the things that energized me and energized a lot of the children. We had horseback riding lessons. We had a great swimming hole, which was spring fed. We gardened, and I will tell you, I mean, there was child labor was very valuable because you had 39 children who could pick corn and pick beans and weed strawberries and all of those kinds of things. But we also made our own fun and we built things. We built a chicken house. When I was 12 years old, I was part of a really big summer project where we were building a stone chicken house for the 200 to 300 chickens. We were going to become completely self-sufficient. The big sisters, not the big brothers, the big sisters were in charge of this. And every day we would gather stones from the huge, as you know, the New England stone walls that are so famous. We would collect the stones from those stone walls, and we built this chicken coop that housed 300 chickens. And I learned so much. I felt like a pioneer woman. Uh, and, it was it was a surreal existence in a certain way, but you took pleasure in the learning, not only the learning of physical things. And canning was something that we did. We would put up hundreds of bushels of apples and pears that we would make into pear sauce and tomatoes for tomato juice that we would then eat during the winter. And to this day, more than 50 years later, every Columbus Day weekend, so this weekend that has just passed, I engage in canning. And this weekend, with two friends, one of whom is Kathy, we canned 3 bushels of applesauce. And it brings me back to my childhood and to that incredible, wonderful feeling, the smell of cooking apples and the pressure to get hundreds and hundreds of bushels, all canned before the apples went bad. There were just those kinds of experiences. Music, the Gregorian chant that we learned and sang in church every single day. We went to Mass 365 days a year. We went to benediction 365 days a year. To this day, I can read Gregorian chant as though, it were, regular Western music. Some of those experiences that stay with you really, really bring back enormous pleasure when you revisit them. And so those things for me stick out more than the cruel elements. And I've been able to capitalize, I think, on those things. We also had a very classical education. And the woman that was put in charge of our schooling was a phenomenally beautiful woman, Sister Anne Mary, whose father had been a principal. She was at Radcliffe. And as I mentioned, these were educated, intellectual people, many of them having gone to Harvard and Radcliffe. And she was the most amazing human being. She learned every single musical instrument so that she could give lessons to any of the children. We had our own band, and she never, ever hit a child. She was not one of those 8 angels. She was oblivious to some of the other treatment that went on. But she was an extraordinary human being, and I feel as though I received an extraordinarily classical education, minus a few bits for sure, not the least of which was that Sister Catherine felt there was no need for us to learn biology, since we were going to go on and be nuns for our lives, and the boys were going to be brothers. But I hope I've given you a sense of how one can mix in the good with the bad, and how the good for me was able to overcome the bad.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's important for Christians to remember, right? Like all things work together for good. So, a lot of times people will focus only on the bad, but even God can take even the worst of situations and use that for good in that. So, yeah, it's a good lesson there. So, um, okay, so I'm looking at question 3. I think you've kind of answered it already. So, just to sort of spin it, maybe you could mention while you were in this environment or in this cult kind of thing growing up, what were some of the things, either doctrines or teachings or behaviors or that sort of thing, that you most caught as, yeah, that this is not right. It shouldn't be this way. And you mentioned, so when you left, it wasn't actually by your choice. So maybe just explain that early period, like how did you go about making sense of the world and living in those
Sure.
early years right after.
Well, our daily upbringing was really and truly religiously centered, and it was centered around that dogma of the Catholic Church that says there is no salvation outside the Catholic Church. Once Father Feeney was excommunicated, or even leading up to that, because he, from exercising his priestly functions in the Diocese of Boston, we developed code words for things. I mentioned that we had Mass every day, but we weren't allowed to let the outside world know that because Father Feeney was excommunicated. So we had code words for everything. And our code word for Mass every morning was first breakfast. And the breakfast that we all ate as a community, admittedly, little sisters in one room, little brothers in another, big sisters in a third, and big brothers in the fourth room, was second breakfast. We had a code word that referred to all of those Catholics that did not support Father Feeney. And he called them pious frauds. And the short for that was just PFs. And we referred to everybody outside in the world as that were Catholic and not supportive as PFs. We also, were unable, the members of the community were unable. They had to cut off their relationships with their own families. And so even when their parents died, they were not allowed to go to the funeral of their parents. There was this, sequestering of people, so in a way that really was, cultish. And so, our focus was on the dogma of no salvation outside the Catholic Church. And anyone who didn't believe that dogma was going to hell. So needless to say, I believe that that was the most important religious belief that I had to hold on to. In addition to that, though, there was a certain paranoia that Sister Catherine was developing, in which she was always telling us that the country was going to be run by communists. The communists were coming. And remember, I do remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, but that the communists were coming and we had to pray the rosary every single day to ward off the communists. But then she would inform us, and she would close all the doors and just talk to the children in the evening in our refectories. She would say, but when the communists arrive, when they come, we are going to flee into the desert in Arizona. And I had always had this picture of Arizona from my geography book with the painted desert. And I'd always thinking, oh, I would love to go and see the painted desert. And suddenly when I'm about 11 or 12 years old, the painted desert becomes a holding pen that we're out in Arizona waiting till the communists find us. And then she said, and when the communists find us, we will be martyrs. We will die and at their hands. And because we are martyrs, our souls will go to heaven right away. And I thought to myself, well, if we're going to be killed by the communists, why are we fleeing into the desert? Why don't we just let them kill us here? But inside myself also, I thought, but I am never going to be killed. I will become a communist before I am killed. Those two notions in my head, why did we have to flee if we were supposed to embrace martyrdom? And I will convert to something else rather than be killed for my faith, were two notions that I kept to myself. I questioned a lot of things that Sister said, but her word, was gospel. Father Feeney's word was gospel, and no one, not a single person, adult or child within the community, would counter anything that they said. So I kept building up these notions. And the fact of the matter is, I just knew I wasn't a strong enough person to accept martyrdom. And that didn't really bother me. But I did very, very adamantly hold to the dogma that there was no salvation outside the Catholic Church. And it was only after I left and started to see that these pious frauds, as they were referred to, were actually wonderful human beings. And that the Jewish people that I came to meet and in my business, even very young, went to work for a brokerage firm, and that a number of the brokers were Jewish. And I realized they are such good human beings. And it really started to change my mind about, our small clan of Catholics being the only people in the couple of billion people that were in the world who were going to make it to heaven. And that was the beginning of a metamorphosis for me that I have found very, very rewarding. And for me personally, as a Catholic, I embrace the approach that our current Pope, Pope Francis, has towards acceptance and openness, which, some Catholics and some people in the Curia and some people in the, in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church don't agree with. But I have observed, and I think for me, it has been wonderful to observe how people live their lives, that there are Catholics who are not good people, and there are Muslims and Jewish people and Protestants and all kinds of religions that have wonderful people. And so my religion is Catholic, but I am enormously open and accepting of all other religions. Is that helpful?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. All right. Okay. What one thing that you kind of just how did you kind of right after being kicked out in the early years, like how what was that like making sense of this world that you had no idea about? Did you want to maybe take a few minutes to explain what that was like and how you navigated that?
Yes, indeed. It was quite amazing. That first summer, when I was kicked out, I stayed with my father's sister, my aunt, and her husband and their 4 children. And I suddenly saw family life in a way I hadn't seen it since I was 6 years old, and how they had dinner together and how they watched television. And one of the cousins was exactly my age, and he was heading off to college in September. And I knew that was not going to be my life, but I didn't know what my life was going to be like. And I'll just fill in a little bit. During my senior year of high school, at the place we called it the Center, uh, I was asked to apply to 2 colleges for admission. One was Bates College, where my father had gone, and one was Vassar. And the reason I was applying was because some of the local authorities had challenged whether or not our school was adequate education. And the center, Sister Catherine, desperately wanted to make sure that she was able to, control the education and have us within the community and not have to go to the local schools. So they had me apply to both of those colleges in my senior year. And so in early spring of 1966, I received 2 letters back saying I had been accepted to both colleges. And at that point, Sister Catherine breathed a sigh of relief. She had already told me I was going to be leaving. But she used me, as I was very, very good at school, and she used me as ammunition to get the school accredited, which it was. But she also then had me write the letter back to each of those schools saying I would not be attending. So there I was in the summer of 1966, looking at my cousin Paul, who was heading off to college, and realizing his life, he has a path forward in his life, and I had none. I still had to learn literally everything about the world. As I mentioned earlier, I'd never been to a restaurant, I'd never read a newspaper or a magazine. But that summer, I busied myself. And in fact, there had been no sexual education at all. And my aunt had a book, a Dr. Spock book, if you remember back in the 60s. He was the, kind of the guru pediatrician. So I read through that book that summer and kind of satisfied or answered a lot of questions I had no knowledge about. And but the incredible thing for me was the language of the world. I had never heard a swear word. I had never heard even a slang word. I had never heard of any actors. I didn't know who Frank Sinatra was. I didn't know who Marilyn Monroe was for sure. I didn't know any baseball players, Red Sox players. And so for me, this experience of being tossed out into the world was one in which I had wide open eyes, wide open ears, and I kept my mouth shut because I was afraid to say anything. I was afraid for 2 reasons. One, my ignorance would become so evident, and then people would wonder why I was quite so ignorant. But 2, I also was hiding the fact that, remember, I was still in the Boston area, that I grew up at this center. The press referred to us, our 100 people, as Feeneyites. And the last thing I wanted anyone to find out was that I was, in fact, a Feeneyite. So I had to learn my way very slowly and very gradually. And I was so uncomfortable talking to people about my upbringing. And the amazing thing is, I carried this on through my life. It took me 9 years, but I got my degree in economics from Boston University by attending school at night as I continued to work and move forward. And but I've never told anyone about my story. And by the time I moved to New York in 1975, and I now had a really respectable job and continued moving up the corporate ladder, I didn't worry so much about people finding out. I still, though, didn't know how to talk about my upbringing. You know, if you ask someone, where did you grow up? And they say, oh, I grew up in Chicago. And where did you go to college? Well, I went to Notre Dame. It's just a nice little conversation. But I couldn't give that. You know, a 3-minute conversation would be a 300-minute conversation for me. So I
Yep.
kept it all bottled up. And by the time I started putting pen to paper when I was 60 years old, I had only told 3 people in the entire world my full story. And one of whom was my husband, who did know it. And I was so cute because when I told him the story, he grew up in Washington, D.C. and he went to St. Albans School. So he had also a beautiful education, and he'd gone to Harvard. And, you know, he looked at me and he said, I feel so sorry for you. I said, why? Don't feel sorry for me. He said, you never went to a dance. I said, oh my goodness, that is the last thing you should be feeling sorry for me about. You know, some of the things that you don't experience in life that other people think are so important really aren't important if you haven't experienced them. And so that is another reason why I don't wish I had had outside of, wishing that, I could have had that relationship with my parents. I don't wish for almost anything else. And the really wonderful, wonderful family story in our case was that when my parents finally left, which my mother kind of left 2 years after I did, and my father left with 2 of my siblings a year after Sister Catherine died. When the family all came back together, there was no animosity. There was no, why did you do this to us? And I think importantly, it was because my parents, much more so than other parents, sent the message that they loved us. And once they came out, and many, many, many of the center children then left at that time, their house was open to anyone and everyone. One of the center kids went to MIT in 3 years, basically lived at my parents' house the entire time he went to MIT. They were generous, they were open, they were open-minded, they had great senses of humor, they loved entertaining. And I used to be amazed. I used to think, gosh, they left the center and it's as though they just went back to the world they already knew, while I, of course, had been struggling to kind of make myself, quotes, quotes, normal in the outside world. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. I think an interesting lesson that you said a while back that I get from you is, you know, so many people are miserable and that sort of thing because they adopt this compare and contrast. They're always comparing themselves to someone who's got it better or something. Whereas we do need to learn, be content with what God's given us and be happy with what we have and that sort of thing. So that's an interesting lesson that I got from your story there. All right, one last biographical question here. So again, you've kind of given us the rundown on what your life was like after the cult and that sort of thing. But just for the Christians in the audience, maybe focus. What was your relationship like with Christ after? Have you continued to grow in Christ? And yeah, what was it from a religious standpoint after leaving the cult?
Yes. Well, at first, at the very, very beginning, I was hugely Catholic, very much, very anxious, perhaps, that I not do anything that we had been taught was evil, and not really even understanding all the things that might send me to hell. But I do remember, I didn't tell this story in my own book, I don't think, but I do remember one time there was a church in Boston called Arch Street, and it was a Franciscan church. And I remember going to confession there, which is what Catholics do. They don't have to do it all the time, but I went to confession. And the priest started grilling me with questions that so shocked me. And I thought, what is this all about? Because we always went to confession to Father Feeney. And it was not as though I had done anything. I certainly hadn't committed murder. And I walked out of there and said, that's it. I am not going to confession anymore. I thought that it was abusive to me emotionally, to me intellectually. And that was kind of a first step aside. And I have now some wonderful priest friends, and I have talked to them, and some wonderful Jesuit friends, and I adore the Jesuits because they're so brilliantly intellectual, and they're drawn to, as is this Pope, as you know, they're drawn to being a Jesuit because they are innately intellectual and querying about things. And so, and then I went through a phase in my 20s, as many people do from an array of different religions, where I really wasn't very Catholic. But as I grew older and as I, you know, married my husband and, had my children, and remember, my husband was divorced, so I was unable to get married in the Catholic Church. And I decided, because he did not want to be Catholic. And by then, I was open-minded enough and liberal enough to say, what's important is our faith. And while I've never converted to Episcopalianism and consider myself Catholic, I go to Catholic churches, I go to Anglican churches, I go to Lutheran churches, I go to Greek Orthodox churches. I just find the different ways that people worship God to be fascinating. And I love the pomp and the circumstance and the cultural elements of worship. I find them wonderful. My personal religion and my personal point of view, I keep very much to myself. I don't proselytize. For me, the gospel of the mission of the gospel is how you treat others. Do unto others as you would have done them do to you. And for me, I think a lot of my spirituality has come out in the form of taking care or helping those in need. I mentor middle school girls at a Catholic school in Harlem, Our Lady Queen of Angels School. And for me, that is a mission. I started a company that basically serves the healthcare needs of the LGBTQ community. And many of them are stressed horrifically in their lives because they feel discarded, unloved. So for me, it's I see the mission of Christ in how you try to take care of others. We grew up learning the corporal works of mercy and the spiritual works of mercy. For me, I'm drawn to the corporal works of mercy. I think prison ministry is an amazing and awesome ministry, and I support it. I don't engage in it myself, though I would be happy to, but there are only so many hours in a day, but I'm supportive of it. And so for me, I understand and believe and respect contemplative life. And that's where the spiritual works of mercy come in. For me, I try to engage, feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, harbor the harborless, visit the sick, bury the dead. That's what I try to do. And for me, dogma is far less important. And specifically, how you worship God is not important. But I am drawn to what I have known and loved all my life, which is the ritual and the music. And but a good sermon for me is so enlightening, and good sermons can be given by a whole array of people from different religions.
Gotcha. Okay, so I think so. Getting into sort of the differences, and that you would see the essence of the Christian gospel of Christianity proper, as I sometimes call it. Mostly of these corporal, I think is what you called it, corporal mercies, or corporate mercy. So you're doing it, the things that you do, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's essential. The spiritual mercies, or the dogmas and doctrines, you said they're less important, but would you still see those as essential? Like, say something like the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus is Is that essential for someone to believe that,
Oh
or?
yes, yeah. Well, you know, let's admit that much of dogma is based in mystery. You
Okay.
know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when she died recently, I wrote a blog about her, and in watching her life, I felt that she was strongly influenced by the four cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And to live your life with those, I think, is exemplary. And what I realized in doing some research on them, because I always thought of them as being very Catholic um, little virtues, is that they were first, discussed by Plato. So they are elements that are important in being decent and good human beings. They have nothing to do with being Catholic or Jewish in the case of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. By the spiritual works of mercy, I think more of the works of mercy that are done by religious, like nuns and priests. Um, they're counsel the doubtful, to advise the ignorant, to admonish sinners, those kind, to pray for the living and the dead. Apart from that, in terms of the creed, and the dogmas, I accept and admit to myself that a lot of those things are you take on faith, and they are mysteries, and it's called the mystery of faith. And if I don't necessarily comprehend it all, for me, that's okay. If I'm leading the life that I think I was called to lead, that gives me a lot of comfort. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, yeah, cool. In terms of my own view, if you want to hear it, you're the guest, so
Sure.
it's, yeah, it's a, yeah, I sort of see it as both and. So I think that I sort of like I'm a Protestant, so my background is based on the Bible, like sola scriptura type deal. So I kind of let the Bible explain, okay, which verses are, sorry, which doctrines or beliefs are essential. So that would be the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But then there's also that doing. So I sort of see it as like a both and type thing. You have to obey. If you love Jesus, you'll obey his commands and do all those great things. You'll bear the good fruit. I think as John says. So yeah, that's sort of my views. I sort of see it as a both and type deal. Yeah, I don't know if that's interesting or helpful, but
Yes, and I accept that, and I love to see people engaging in both. But I think for me, the exercise of my religion is a quiet thing. I I'm not I don't proselytize. And perhaps the reason I don't is because I grew up in such a proselytizing environment. And so I've developed an innate aversion to being kind of out there, about my religion. And I think one can understand that when you were brought up believing that absolutely everyone in the whole world, except these 100 people that were part of us, were doomed to eternal fire. And to me, it made no sense. And so now I don't want to be overly doctrinaire. I think it's important for me to lead the life that I feel I've been called to lead, and lead it in a Christian way.
gotcha. All right, that sort of answers the next question, because I wanted to turn it to you. Like, what do you think are the main differences between Christianity proper, as I would call it, or true Christianity versus cults that just go by the name of Christianity. And I'm thinking you might think, well, it's this emphasis on doctrine or dogma versus actually helping people. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. Yeah, like what do you think is the main differences there?
I think that in many cases, what turns a communal activity or a group of people who feel about a certain way that may be different or out of the mainstream, What turns it into a cult is the behavior of the leaders. And there is an array of things, and I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a therapist or whatever, but they're very, very evident. And once I applied those criteria to my own upbringing and my own childhood, it became evident. One person emerges as the leader. The rules don't apply to them. Everyone has to conform. Break your connections with the outside world. In the case of my father, here when we moved to Still River and he suddenly, was there being in charge of fixing the automobiles, you could see the deliberate attempt to let him not do anything intellectual. And he told me once when I was about 12, he and my mother spoke, and they decided that they were going to get up in the middle of the night, take one of the cars, and come and wake all 5 of their children up. And remember, if I was 12, my baby sister was only 6, and they were going to drive away. But I can imagine the conversations that they had, and he even referred to them. He said, then what was I going to do? He would have a wife and 5 children to support. And for about 11 or 12 years, he'd no longer been teaching. He'd no longer been writing. There was no way he could go back to Boston College and say, can I teach? And you can see when you are put into a position where they deliberately cut off your ability to maintain or to grow the person that you had anticipated you would be, they break you. And he thought, I'm sure, and ultimately he thought, well, if I can't support them. And then so they rationalized that at least we were getting a really good Catholic upbringing. Those to me are the elements of a cult. If you don't agree with them, they kick you out. And when they kick you out, you might as well have be dead. And I watched that happen to members of our community, so that when I knew I was being kicked out, that one of the greatest pains for me was the fact that I was going to be treated as though I were dead. And these were the only people I knew in the whole world. Fortunately, I broke through some of that. And there was a way in which I actually defied Sister Catherine. And then I will actually say, I think for the benefit of at least all the other children who had not made the choice to live here, that her premature death at the age of 67 was a blessing. And it allowed the place to break up. And there were huge internecine warfares, frankly, between the big brothers and the big sisters. And, ultimately that one entity evolved or devolved into about 7 other entities, a couple of which maintain an austere adherence to the dogma of no salvation outside the Catholic Church. And another has become a brother-sister Benedictine monastery out in Petersham, Massachusetts. They are the most wonderful human beings. And I support them and I visit with them, and I think that they are exemplary. So, all of them will argue that they are the true and, just and righteous Catholics. And yet they have little use for each other, which is fascinating.
Yeah, it's that's one thing. So again, being a Protestant, it's interesting to get the Catholic take and what sort of caused the split. From what I gathered, your quote unquote cult or the center was really dogmatic about anyone outside of the Catholic Church is damned. And then I'm guessing the Catholic Church has changed on that. So now they view Protestants as quote unquote separated brethren and that sort of thing. So just out of curiosity, was that the cause? Like, why did they excommunicate Feeney? Was that the reason, or?
Well, they couldn't possibly excommunicate him for espousing a dogma of the Catholic Church. So they ultimately excommunicated him for disobedience. He was a Jesuit, as I remember, and he ultimately was kicked out of the Jesuits. But his Jesuit provincial, his superior, told him he had to leave the center in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and go out to Holy Cross College, which is a Jesuit college in Worcester, to teach English. He refused. Then the Vatican asked him to come over to Rome so that they could have a discussion about his doctrinal issues, etc. And he refused. And so it was on that basis, it was that stated basis that he was excommunicated. Now, some will argue, and I may not even disagree with them, that that was not a legitimate rationale for excommunication. And so maybe truly de jure, he was not excommunicated. But in the early 1970s, 1972-3, the Catholic Church reached out to the organization, to the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, to Father Feeney, who was by now quite frail, and this was after Sister Catherine died, to have a reconciliation. And around 1973, Father was reconciled with the Catholic Church. And then he died in, I believe it was 1978.
Gotcha. Okay. Just out of curiosity, if you don't mind me just getting your take on the official position of the Catholic Church, like how did they? So if that position was dogma, which I understand it was infallible, like how do they reconcile that with the later teaching that Protestants are just separated brethren? Like, is there a way that they harmonize that, or that
well, that is, I mean, I think interpretation. Let's remember, these rules were all made by men, okay, and I don't mean men versus women, but they were men versus women. And religions have this ability to control and make rules that suit their own purposes. And I think that what Catholicism has tried to do is much more have Catholicism read the mission of the gospel, as opposed to the de facto interpretation. Remember, in the 4th century, they had the Nicene Creed comes out from the first council that was in Nicaea, and they would excommunicate each other for the interpretation of a word in Greek. Now, having studied both Greek and Latin, there are different interpretations when you have cases like dative and ablative and accusative and things like that. And these were perhaps very smart men. Again, there were no women at that time. And yet they would turn it into a binary outcome. And on this side, you are right, and on that side, you are wrong. And everything became doctrinaire. And I think that ecumenism has really tried to focus much more on the substance of the teachings rather than creating rules out of them. Now, I am no theologian, and I am certainly not a Jesuit, since only men can be Jesuits. But the fact of the matter is, I would certainly, prefer to have someone who is truly an ecclesiastical person argue some of those points. But I've spent a lot of time talking to Jesuits and really intellectual people, and they are much more, they're not rule bound, because they think intellectually about stuff rather than how can I control the masses, if you will. And remember, Catholicism at one time was the largest religion in the world, and control was what they needed and wanted. And I think today it's much less about that, and it's much more about the messaging.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thank you for indulging that question. I know that isn't your area. You're not a theologian, but yeah.
No, I am not. And I like to ask some of my friends, when you post this, to please respond to whether or not I answered that okay.
Yeah, no, I think it was good. I think it was a good answer. Yeah, it gave me some insight on how they approach it and that sort of thing. So, okay. So here's another question. So question number 8. So this is, I think, one that you're gonna like then. So obviously you don't hold to strict doctrines like papal infallibility. These are men and that sort of thing. So how do you think Christians, it's important for you, the doings, love your neighbor like yourself and that sort of thing, and do actions that show love to your neighbor. How do Christians go about getting knowledge about what they should be doing? Like what are the specifics of what is good or what is not, or what does Christ want me to do with my life and that sort of thing? Yeah, like what by what means do we come to that knowledge in your view?
Well, for me, I think a lot of it is introspection. Uh, Catholics do go to mass, and they hear missives, lectures, sermons from the pulpit. But those are very much under the auspices, or um, formed by the beliefs or the proclivities of the person, giving them, the priest. And people go to particular churches because they're either more conservative in their own beliefs or less conservative. And you have a huge array, which I have to imagine you have in a variety of other religions. I mean, if you look at the Jewish religion, you have Reform, and you have conservative, and you have Orthodox, and you have, a whole array. And so they're kind of angles of the religion. And so I think you can be served up a platter of lots of ways of thinking about it. And I think people have that opportunity. And I think people are drawn to different things. And if you look in the New Testament, I mean, Jesus doesn't, I don't think there's anywhere I've read outside of throwing the money changers out of the temple, that he attacks people for their faith. He the Good Samaritan story is one that is, one that he's talking about someone doing good despite not being part of the religion. And he doesn't make things doctrinaire, which is why I've always found it a little odd that the Catholic Church, which was certainly the first Christian religion, which emerged from the apostles, and St. Peter was the first pope, that it's ended up taking such a more focused and rule-bound interpretation, and because that nothing in the gospel really reads that way. And so I'm not sure how others develop their own. Some people are very, very tradition bound, but for me, having them brought up in a singularly narrowed focus, and being a person who kept wanting to push out beyond that narrow focus, my whole approach, I think, was guided by who I am as a person, who God made me, what I'm, how you can call it DNA, but a certain kind of resilience and intellectualism, a challenge. Other people feel very comfortable not challenging. And for them, how they lead their lives and how they form themselves in whatever religion they are, Catholic or otherwise, may be much more bound by tradition. And I think I err, if that's the right word, or have a proclivity to actually think out of the box and try to be very, very open-minded, because I think that's my instinct and that's my nature. I'm not sure I've answered that very well, but
No, like I said, it's great answers, right? I'm asking. I want to know what your take is on these things. So, okay. What one last quick follow up on that? Do you also see there's any role for the Bible to inform, or is it mostly all coming from introspection from within? I guess.
oh no, I said that. There's the Old Testament and the New Testament, and let's remember that. A lot of the what we'll call the Pentateuch, but the first 5 books of the Old Testament are all about rules and regulations. And when you look at some of the very rigid religions today, Orthodox Judaism, Muslims, uh, even some very Orthodox approaches to Catholicism, they pull their rules and guidelines right out of the Old Testament. And I mean, that's why you'll notice that they're all dressing similarly in essence. But, and interestingly, when I was growing up at the center, we weren't allowed really to read the Old Testament. I'm not exactly sure why, but there was enough reference to it in the Psalms and things like that, which we read for sure. But for us, the New Testament, that was what I read hundreds of times probably as a child before I was kicked out. And to me, that was, it became, kind of my instinct to go to. And, I found it even back then as a teenager thinking about it, that nothing in the New Testament seemed to be as rigid as we were. So I think my mind was already open to an interpretation that was the way I read the New Testament. And so I am very much guided by what I will call the mission of the Gospels. I think the mission of the Gospels. I sometimes find St. Paul a bit of a challenge. And that's just my own. But not everybody has to have all 70 books of the Bible as their guide. I think you can get overwhelmed. For the gospel, the mission of the gospel is something that I feel very comfortable with.
Gotcha. Yeah, it reminds me of, I've had Dr. Randall Rouser on the show. He takes sort of a very similar approach to the Bible, right? You approach the Bible through the lens of Jesus. That's the central focus of the gospel, and you can use that to. So yeah, you're in good company on that front. So.
Well, that's good.
Perfect. Okay, yeah. So I think that covers it in terms of my list. Is there anything else that you would want me to ask you about, or you would like to bring up for people to know?
Well, I think, my goodness, you have really covered the waterfront, and in some theological ways that I will argue I may not be the most erudite on. But with regard to my story in my book, I will say that I believe in grace, and that's the very first little prelude in my book. And for me, in the Catechism, as we Catholics learned it, grace is an unearned gift from God. And I like to see grace as a gift that you can either accept or not. And I wrote that in my story because Mother Mary Claire Vincent, who had been, was the only African American at the center. And she was also my English teacher in high school. And I remained close to her till she was 90 years old. She became the prioress of the Benedictine monastery that I mentioned to you, moved out to Petersham. And she has written a book. She sadly died about 5 years ago at the age of 90. But she said to me, she said, "You are so generous, and there's a special place in heaven for you." And at the time, I thought, no. I give you what I give you because I so adore you and I so respect what you are about. She went, "Oh, no, you're not getting it." She said, "You respond to a grace." And that was the first time I really thought about grace in that way. And when you think about grace, it really reflects itself in so many things. There is the grace of having humor. There is the grace of being joyful. There's the grace of generosity. There's the grace of patience, which I will argue I am totally devoid of. But there are these wonderful graces, and they help you fulfill and lead your life. And some of them you grasp, and some of them you don't. But not everyone can be everything, and that's why we are all different. So I love to think of grace, and I believe that the grace of gratitude is what led me to write my book. I am grateful for the life I've led. I'm grateful, frankly, for the education I had as a child. I'm grateful for the resilience that I've been able to achieve. And I'm grateful for the fact that somehow I was led to write this book, and it has helped. It has made the lives of the children that I grew up with better. And, you know, grace is kind of a difficult thing to define per se, but when you can see it as kind of an array of responses to, you know, important elements of life, I am guided by that. And so for me, I believe that the grace of gratitude is what led me to write the book. And it allowed me to not be angry, to not be vindictive, to not, have an attitude of woe is me. And by doing it that way, I have helped the lives of the other children that I grew up with. So, again, I hope that's just my own approach. But I have spoken to, men of the cloth who are highly intellectual, and we end up on the same page.
Excellent. All right, perfect. Yeah. So I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to answer these questions. I hope on your end you enjoyed the interview. And
I did, and I will tell you, if people would like my book, my website, which I think you've mentioned, is patriciachadwick.com. It also has a number. I write blogs on a lot of subjects. The one on Ruth Bader Ginsburg is there. I do write a lot, and I'm actually working on a second book, which is about my growing up on Wall Street. And so I hope that will be kind of an inspirational book as well.
excellent. Yeah, I'll definitely post links to your website as well as that blog there on RBG.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Perfect. So yeah, I think with that said, I hope the audience enjoyed the show. Next week, I'll probably be posting up an old show that I did on SNS with David. I haven't decided which one it's going to be yet, but look forward to that one, guys. So have a great week, everybody.
And happy Thanksgiving to you.
Thank you very much. I will enjoy my turkey for sure.
Indeed. All right. Take care.
All right. Take care.